Complex numbers? Well, I thought all numbers were complex, and now you're giving me a special type of a number that's complex? Well, yeah. What we call a complex number is a number that will be this. Imagine I have some letter I, and I'm going to set that equal to -1. Now remember, we've talked about in the past that a negative number underneath the root, or underneath an even index root, was a number that we just didn't deal with because it didn't have a result in the set of all real numbers. However, it does have a result in the set of the complex numbers. And we'll talk a little bit about what complex numbers are coming on up. But to begin with, we designate this I as a unit. It's called our imaginary unit. Such that if I squared both sides, I would get an I squared equals a -1. Now we use the term imaginary not because it's a make-believe number. We just call it an imaginary unit. So now what that means is if we had some number maybe like the square root of -25, rather than looking at that in times past and just throwing up our hands and saying it can't be done, well, you're right. It couldn't have been done just in the set of real numbers, but if we add the complex plane to it, we can work with this number. So this becomes the square root of -1 times the square root of 25. I can break that up into its individual roots. So it's the square root of -1 times the square root of 25. We identified the square root of -1 as an I and 5, so it'd be an I, and the square root of 25 is a 5. And typically we'll write the coefficient first. We'll write this as a 5 times an I, or 5I. And that's the designation that we can use in order to work with problems that have a negative with underneath a radical. So let's give us another thing. So imagine I have some square root of -b. Oops, sorry. Square root of -b. I would rewrite that as the square root of -1 times some b, whatever that might be. Break that up into its two roots. So -1 times the square root of -1 times the square root of b. And we said that the square root of -1 is an I. So we can rewrite this one as I square root b. So again, just a little bit of practice how we're gonna work with numbers that have a negative in it. So let's look at a couple examples and see if we can get a sense of how to deal with this. We already did square root of -25. So let's look at the square root of -9. What are you thinking? Well, I hope you're thinking, well, we can rewrite that as the square root of -1 times 9. Break that on up. So square root of -1 times the square root of 9. Square root of -1, we're going to call that an I, our imaginary unit, and the square root of 9 is 3. And I'm just going to rewrite it as 3i. So the square root of -9 is 3i. Let's look at the square root of -3. Break that on up. So that's a -1 times a 3. Rewrite that as individual square roots. Square root of -1 again was a I, and what's left? A root 3. Typically, if I have a root, I will write that following the I. However, if my value is a constant like 3, I'll write that before my value. So I'll put it in terms of constant, then my imaginary unit, and then after that, any irrational parts left over. The last example we want to look at is let's look at the square root of -80. How can we simplify that? Well, let's break it down to all of its important factors. So first of all, one important factor, and this is a -1. Now with the 80, I'm going to rewrite it as factors, one where it's including its greatest, or it's including its perfect square, its greatest perfect square. And with 80, is 80 divided by 16? I need to do let's see, what is 80? 80 is an 8 times a 10. So neither one of those is it. That's a 4 times the 2, and that's a 5 times the 2. is 80. So 4 goes into it. 9 goes into 80. No, does 16 go into 80? 4 times, 5 times? 5, 0, 3. So 16. So 80 is, or 16 is a factor of 80. So I'm going to rewrite this as 16 times a 5. From there, the square root of negative 1 is an I, so I can pop that out. 16, the square root of 16 is a 4. And then I have the irrational part left over, which is the square root of 5. So square root of negative 80, with a little bit of work of trying to figure out what my factors of 80 were, reduces down to, or simplifies to, 4I root 5. And I guess one thing I noticed too is, and I told you that this is my preference of writing the constant I than the radical, but that doesn't mean it's wrong or right that way. This also could be written as 4 root 5 I. All we have to do is be really careful that we don't include that I underneath the radical. So we need to make sure that radical stops before we get to the I. So both of those are correct. If you write it the second way, which is fine, just make sure you don't include that imaginary unit underneath the root index or underneath the root.